Everyone, welcome to another Writing Support Center workshop. My name is Giselle, and today's topic is writing about race and ethnicity. So before we begin today, there are a couple things that I do recommend that you do. If you've taken a Writing Support Center workshop before, these things may be familiar to you. So if they are, feel free to skip ahead. If this is your first workshop, I do recommend that you download and complete the accompanying activity worksheet. That worksheet should be available wherever you access this workshop, whether it be on the Writing Support Center Canvas shell or on your instructor's Canvas shell. There should be a worksheet. Go ahead and download that so that you can do it while you watch this workshop. And the second thing is to take your time. This is a recorded workshop, and the positive of that is that you can pause and rewind as you need. All right, so I just wanted to go over today's workshop goals. The first goal is to learn to use appropriate and respectful terms when discussing and writing about people of color and other historically marginalized groups. The second is to consider how to utilize sources that use outdated terms. And the last is to reflect on how you're on your own writing and times you've had to write about race and ethnicity. With that said, we're going to begin with an opening reflection. So on your worksheet, you'll find this as the first question. And the questions for this reflection are, have you ever been assigned a paper that required you to write about race or ethnicity? How did you feel when writing this paper? Did you find anything challenging when writing this paper? And what questions did you or do you have? So go ahead, pause here, take a moment to fill out the question. And once you're done, go ahead and resume the workshop. Alrighty, if you're still writing, go ahead and keep pausing and continue when you're done. Okay, so to begin, we're going to talk about the considerations when writing about race and ethnicity. So things you should think about when you are writing a paper about race and ethnicity. So it is important for writers to make informed choices that about their language and take responsibility for those choices. So if you are unaware of how to write about race and ethnicity, it's important that you do a little bit of research so you do it in a respectful way, or of course take this workshop so you can understand how to do that. Accurate language ensures that you're writing about others in a respectful manner and in crafting effective and credible arguments. So if you are using language that is accurate, aka also respectful to those groups you're writing about, you will then become more credible because your argument is respectful to those that you're writing about. Writing about various groups of people can and should be done without perpetuating harmful stereotypes. All right, so I want to start with some best practices. So these are things that you should just remember when you're writing about race and ethnicity. 4 simple rules that you can follow that will help transform your writing when writing about race and ethnicity. Since it can be a sensitive topic and you want to do it with respect for those that you're writing about. So the first tip I have is to use people first language. So use terms that focus on people rather than on the method of categorization to ensure your language is not dehumanizing. So you want to acknowledge the person first, right? You don't want to essentialize them by referring to, whatever that trait is that you're referring to. So for example, you want to use something like people with mental illness rather than the mentally ill. You also want to use people with disabilities rather than disabled people, and you want to use enslaved peoples rather than slaves. With each of these examples, you're putting the person first and acknowledging their humanity before hyper-focusing on whatever trait that might be, whether it be in relation to their disability or history or their race or ethnicity. I do want to say in this workshop that we're mostly going to talk about how to talk respectfully about race and ethnicity, but I might give you some tips on how to talk about people with disabilities or even people with different socioeconomic statuses. So I will cover some of that, but mostly we're going to be focusing on race and ethnicity. All right, so the next tip is don't use adjectives as nouns. So what that means is using adjectives as nouns is not only grammatically incorrect, it's often demeaning to the people you are describing. So for example, use Black people, not Blacks. Use white people, not whites, right? You want to, again, it's kind of in the same vein as using people first language. You want to humanize the groups that you're talking about. And people are more than just colors, right? We're not just colors. We want to look at the person's humanity before just essentializing them as that color. You want to also avoid terms that imply inferiority or superiority. So replace terms that evaluate or might imply inferiority with non-judgmental language. So what that means is if the language you're using hints at superiority, that this group might be better than the other, you want to alter that language so that it doesn't sound that way. So for example, you want to use historically marginalized populations rather than minority. And I'm going to get a bit more into why you don't want to use minority, since that is a very common term, but you want to stray away from using that. And you want to use working class rather than low class, right? So you want to use terms that are more likely to be less judgmental. So defer to those instead. And lastly, you want to be specific. So when these descriptors are relevant, be as specific as possible to avoid inaccurate or generalized statements. So for example, use Chicanx, O or A, rather than Hispanics, right? So you're being more specific about the group of Latinx people that you're referring to, if required, and use people who use wheelchairs rather than people with disabilities. So if you're talking about a specific group of people with disabilities, you want to refer to that group specifically. So be specific in your language if it's required. All right, so here's a few more tips about writing about race and ethnicity. So the first is to capitalize racial and ethnic groups such as Black, Asian, and Native American / American Indian. So depending on the context, white may or may not be capitalized. Black refers to dark-skinned people of African descent, no matter their nationality. It has also evolved to become a political identity and a term to encompass Black culture in the US. African Americans, on the other hand, refers to people who were born in the United States and have African ancestry, but most people use these terms interchangeably. I will say that the usage of Black became popular in the 1960s, and that's because it replaced other terms that were being used during the Jim Crow era. And then African American became more popular in the 1980s. For some who wanted a more particular term, as some saw Black as a generic term, so they wanted something more particular. The usage of African American and Black depends on personal choice. So default to what a person's particular choice is, or default to what the text uses. But like I said, people use it interchangeably, so you can consider that as well. Don't hyphenate a phrase when used as a noun, but use a hyphen when two or more words are used together to form an adjective. So what that means is, for example, if you're using a noun, African Americans migrated to northern cities. African Americans in this sentence is a noun. So you wouldn't hyphenate. However, when it's an adjective, so when it's a descriptor, you would hyphenate. So African - American literature, right? So you hyphenate it so that it becomes an adjective. So that's just a small thing to consider when you are writing. The terms Latinx, Latina, Latina, Latino are mostly in the US, are used mostly in the US to refer to US residents with Latin American ancestry. So you would use that, preferably over Hispanic. That term has become less used, and Latinx, Latina are both non-binary versions of Latina and Latino. So they're a little bit more inclusive because they consider all genders. So you can think about that when you use them. But those are terms that you use when referring to people from the US with Latin American ancestry. And then finally, there's also Chicanx, Chicana, and Chicano, which are used in reference to Mexican Americans in the US. So Keep in mind that someone who's Latin American might not be Mexican, right? So these are two different things. It is also a more political identity, as not all Mexican Americans identify as Chicanx or Chicano Chicana. So these are terms that you can use in your papers, or might need to use, and maybe they might have been confusing before, but hopefully this helps clear that up. All right, so like I said, I was going to talk more about the term minority. And minority is a term that used to be used a lot more often, but it's fallen out of, it's not really used as much anymore, or scholars are moving away from using the term minority. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So minority is often used to describe people, groups of people who are not part of the majority, which is used most often in the US in reference to people of color. So when people say minorities, they're probably referring to a non-white person. However, the term is being phased out because it implies inferiority, and because minorities often are not in the numerical minority. So as the US has grown increasingly diverse, minorities aren't necessarily minorities anymore population-wise, right? So you want to phase out that term. Other terms that you could use instead could be historically marginalized populations, people of color, or non-white. It just depends on the context that you're referring to people. So it just, in your writing, if you're referring to many groups of non-white people, you could use people of color. I think another thing that I see that's an error is that sometimes people use people of color in reference to Black people, but people of color has grown to include all non-white peoples. So like I said earlier, when you are writing about certain groups, you want to be specific. So instead of using people of color, if you're writing about Latinx people, or if you're writing about Black people, you want to use that term instead of people of color as a catch-all. So just be specific when you need to be. And then historically marginalized populations, you can think of that as people who have historically existed on the margins, so society hasn't fully enveloped them into US culture. So if you're writing a paper that's talking about marginalization and things like that, you can use a historically marginalized population. So that can also include people outside of people of color. So it could be people with disabilities. It could be people who identify as LGBTQ+. So historically marginalized is in reference to more than just people of color. So keep that in mind as well. And then of course, non-white is anyone that is not of European ancestry. So keep in mind that some people can be of European ancestry, even if they are Latinx, right? So Latinx people are of all race and ethnicities, but non-white is in reference to anyone who is not of European ancestry specifically. So keep that in mind. And if it is not possible to avoid using minority, qualify the term with appropriate specific descriptor, religious minority, or rather than minority. So identify what kind of minority are you talking about if you have to use the term, but definitely don't use it in reference to people of color. Don't use the term minorities, right? But you can use it if you're specific about what minority you're referring to. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about is writing with outdated or problematic sources. So if you're writing with sources that are older, there are chances that they're using words that are inappropriate for today's context. Language is constantly changing and evolving, so words that were once okay are no longer okay. So just keep that in mind, that everything's always changing. So it's good to keep up with what terms are best to use. So when analyzing or referencing a source that uses harmful language, so slurs, violent rhetoric, etc., you can do a few things. You can, one, explain that the author or character uses harmful language without stating it verbatim. So for example, you can use this, this phrasing. The author uses a racist slur when discussing context of the quote, indicating that, and then put in your analysis. So if it's relevant to your argument, you can explain why that language is there. Another thing you can do is acknowledge its offensive nature in your analysis. If you must quote that harmful language verbatim, this is especially important if it relates to your argument. So analyzing that language is also an option, and acknowledging that it's racist or that it's harmful. Or you could just provide a footnote as to why the author is using such language. So you can say this text was written in this, in a footnote, this text was written during this time, and this usage of this word was allowed. So you could use a footnote to explain that. But don't change the quote. So you do not want to change a quote or omit the harmful language without acknowledging it. So if you must use the outdated and problematic sources, it's best to acknowledge the harmful language or rhetoric and discuss how it impacts the use and meaning of the text in your analysis. You do need to note that if you do not need to use these dated terms in discussing the subjects in historical context, continue to use contemporary language in your own discussion and analysis. So even if the text is using outdated terms, you don't need to then use those outdated terms in your analysis. You can refer to more updated terms instead. So don't feel the need to use the same language the author is using in your analysis, because that's your voice and you don't need to engage those terms if it's not necessary. Another thing too is if, say, the N word is used during the reading, you also don't need to type that into your paper. You can put it in the brackets, and you can asterisk out any offensive, the rest of the words, so that it's not so blatantly in your paper. So if you need to quote that and there's no way around it, you can also censor it so that you don't need to use the word as it is. Note that if you don't know what to do, you can always ask your professor. So always default to your professor and ask what their preference is. So if you're using a particularly harmful text, or like not a harmful text, but a text that uses a lot of harmful language or racist language or whatever it may be, you can always ask your professor, how do I work with this language? How would you prefer me to talk about it? Or if you don't feel comfortable putting that kind of language in your paper, you can let your professor know and ask them how you can work around that. So as always, just always default to your professor's preferences so that you're writing a paper according to their standards. Alrighty, so that brings us to our closing reflection. So now I want you to think about, what are your key takeaways? What do you plan to apply to your next paper on race and ethnicity? Do you feel more comfortable approaching topics of race and ethnicity in your writing? And what questions do you still have? So take a few moments, think about that. And then when you're ready, continue the video. Alrighty, and this brings us to our last slide, which is our works cited slide. If you'd like to learn more about writing about race and ethnicity, you can go to this article from Hamilton College. It's a great article that also includes information on how to write about socioeconomic status and disability as well. So if you want more information on that, you can go to this resource, and there's plenty of tips there that should help you. If you still have questions and need help with your paper, please visit the Writing Support Center so one of the tutors can help you work on that paper. Thank you for attending today's workshop, and we hope to see you at the next one.